Welcome to the Legal Circle. Today we have with us Richard Brady, partner at Legal Circle, who will talk about the director's liabilities and the considerations that need to be made by directors during this time. We have also with us Miss Ayesha Sultan, a current board member of the French Alliance, a former member and chairman of the Audit and Risk Committee of Smart City Dubai Holding, and an independent executive board and vice chair of TCOM Dubai Holding. So today, Ms. Ayesha will speak about the considerations that board members need to make during times of uncertainty and give us very practical tips on how to manage the position during these times. So just a little bit about Legal Circle before we go on. If you've not been and joined our webinars previously, we are a legal specialist with strong reputation for being agile, nimble, and passionate in our commitment to finding practical legal and commercial solutions for our clients. Part of these webinars is our commitment to bring to you relevant content on both legal and commercial topics. So in practicing adaptive and innovative and cost-effective legal solutions, we're able to offer bespoke advice to businesses, whether you're a startup, a small enterprise, or a multinational corporation. So as I mentioned, today we'll have Richard and Ayesha Sultan speaking. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Mr. Richard, who will commence his discussion. We will leave questions and answers to the end. So after Richard speaks on his topic, Ayesha will hear from Miss Ayesha, and then at the end of it, we'll have a chance for question and answers where we hope we can address all of the queries raised by the participants. Without further ado, I hand you over to Richard. Hi, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suraya. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to go and speak about what you might call general principles with regard to duties and responsibilities within a company, because, of course, these affect the governance of the company. Whilst you might think that the only people with power in a company are the directors, that's not quite true. But directors are what I'm going to concentrate on in my brief speech to you today. First of all, there are three separate groups who have responsibilities within a company. There are shareholders. Now, by and large, shareholders have responsibilities in that they can remove or place directors in their position. They also have limited powers to bring court actions against directors who misbehave on behalf of the company to recover the loss which the director's misbehavior has caused the company. Directors, of course, themselves have power to control the company in the day-to-day operation, and they run the business on a day-to-day basis once they're elected. And officers, well, although they're not directors, you'll find national managers, heads of departments, they may well have serious duties, fiduciary duties, and duties of care towards the company and its running. Now, it's important to note that shareholders and directors can only act as groups. Shareholders must make a majority decision. Directors must make a majority decision at a board meeting when there's a quorum of directors. So they can only act as groups. Officers, national managers, international managers, they can act individually to bind the company, which is why they owe duties to the company, just like directors. All right, let's move on from that, if we may. Now, here are some general principles about aspects of companies. First of all, individual directors have no power to bind the corporation. They must act under the authority of the board of directors. And as I said before, directors and shareholders both operate in groups. This power to bind the company comes from the idea that the director is in fact an agent of the corporation. So agency law governs the relationship between the corporations and the directors and their officers. As agents acting within their authority, they combine the company. Shareholders, of course, own the company. They can elect and remove members of the board of directors. That is how shareholders exercise control. But the board manages the company. They run the business on a day-to-day basis. And of course, it's possible for somebody to be a shareholder and have a job within the company and be an officer and also be a director all at the same time. You can wear all three hats at the same time. Now, in Dubai, Federal Law number 2 of 2015 on the Commercial Companies Law, I'll call it the CCL, relates to directors and managers' liabilities and their duty of care. The CCL is the most referenced legislation you'll hear in Dubai when dealing with directors' duties and day-to-day management of their companies. Now, this principle of breach of fiduciary duty, which we're going to look at later, this is an old common law duty. And so you won't find any uniform set of legislation for directors' criminal liabilities, for their criminal actions. Criminal actions, therefore, are viewed really in this region as actions taken in bad faith. And they're dealt with under several other federal and local laws in the UAE, such as the UAE Civil Code and the UAE Penal Code. Now, the situation of the law in principle has changed really in about the last 30 years with regard to directors' roles within a company. In giant multinational corporations, directors don't really take every single decision that's going to be made. Their job really is not so much managing the company as it would be in smaller companies. Their job is overseeing the activities of the managers and the other officers. Their job really is oversight. Well, LLCs in the UAE normally appoint general managers as opposed to directors, which are more common for private or public joint stock companies. However, directors of public joint stock companies are also liable to additional obligations and duties due to the nature of the company. There's some confusion caused, I'm afraid, by the interpretation into Arabic of the English words. In general, the general manager of a company is in charge of the day-to-day management of the business. And it sometimes is referred to as the director as well, although in fact they're the manager, not the director. And this confusion comes from the interpretation into Arabic of the words. As I said, the general manager, let's call him the managing director to make it easy for me. The managing director is in charge of the day-to-day management of the business, sometimes referred to as a director as well. Regardless of what title you give this person, there are provisions within the CCL which relate to liabilities of a joint stock company, and they apply equally to managers under Article 237 of the CCL. Let's run. Now, as I said, in the last 30 years, legislation outside the region and in the last 5 years within this region has changed the nature of the role, if you like, requiring that business and affairs shall be managed by the core. Well, goes from being managed by the board to the business and affairs of the corporation shall be exercised by or under the direction and subject to the oversight of the board, or shall be managed by under the direction of the board. Of course, the board in big multinationals don't really manage the day-to-day affairs. Their job really is oversight of the officers. Now, directors owe certain duties to companies, no matter where they are in the world. The same duties pretty much, whether it's in Dubai or the rest of the GCC or the rest of the world. They have responsibilities. these responsibilities come from their role within the company, the power which they have. In particular, directors owe a fiduciary duty to the company. So they owe a fiduciary duty of care and loyalty. Now, violation of these duties may cause their removal. It can result in a civil liability to the corporation who they're meant to serve for the loss they've caused the corporation. And of course, it can even result in criminal sanctions if their behavior breaches the criminal law. And that's the same in Dubai and all the GCC states. Let's look at fiduciary duties first of all. Right, I'm a director. That means I've got all sorts of inside knowledge of what the company is intending to do. And so because I have that knowledge, I must take responsibility. They are fiduciaries. And as such, they're required to act for the benefit of the company on all matters. So they have a duty of good faith. That is, they must act in the best interests of the company, not their own best interests. A duty of care, that is to be careful and diligent when carrying out their tasks. And they must be loyal. And by that, of course, they must not act in conflict with their duty of good faith. They must be loyal to the company. Directors and officers owe these duties to the company. Shareholders, believe it or not, don't owe those duties because they're not managers. They have no part in the management of the company. Shareholders, if they wanted to, for some strange reason, could cause the company to suffer a loss and not be punished for it. Whereas a director would certainly be in breach of his duties and at the very least face a civil court action. And of course, a single act could breach your duty of good faith, your duty of care, and your duty of loyalty. If we look at the laws in the UAE, the laws of the CCL, Articles 22 and 23 of the CCL provide for general duties and the liability of the company for the acts of its directors. Article 22 says, a person authorized to act as a manager / director of the company shall extend the care of a diligent person to company matters. Well, a diligent person is a careful and hardworking person. Article 23 says the company is bound by any act or behavior arising out of its manager or director, as well as any employee acting on behalf of the company, because as agents, they combine their principal, the company which is employing them. And this liability can't be removed by writing it into the company's memorandum or articles of association. It's a principal and agent situation, and the law says it exists regardless of what you write into the company's articles of association. Now, the management of the company is delegated upon the manager. This is usually evidenced by their name appearing on the trade license. They're the first point of reference in the company for the shareholders or the authorities if anything's going wrong. Now, if the manager exceeds their powers, that may well make the manager personally liable for the actions which they've taken, depending upon what those actions are. Right, well, we talked about the duties of care, fiduciary duties. Let's see who owes them, okay? Directors always owe these duties, as well as senior officers and general managers, because they may well delegate their powers to juniors to exercise them on their behalf. So are the lower levels of officers in the company responsible and liable? Well, in general, outside the UAE and in the DIFC, the courts will look at the extent of control given to the individual officer and the type of liability being imposed. The more senior your role, the more likely you are to be liable for your actions. Now, shareholders, because they don't manage the company, don't owe these duties, although in small, close corporations, there may be some liability to the other the other shareholders in very close companies. The question of who owes the duties really should be answered by looking at their job title, their function. So if you're looking at their function, I suppose, the more power they have to make decisions concerning the running of the business, the higher level of duty imposed upon them. Okay. Now let's look at the duty of good faith. I'm just going to run through these 3 duties, and then I think you'll have the kind of basic understanding. 20 years ago, nobody really thought about the idea of good faith. It seemed so self-evident. Good faith is good faith. There weren't really any court decisions on it, and there wasn't really much statutory law on it. But over the last 20 years, people have begun to question, what exactly do you mean good faith? Well, one of the changes that brought this case about, or brought this change around, was the case of Smith and Van Gorkum. This is a US case. This is where the directors breached their duty of good faith by failing to bother to get the necessary information in front of them before making a decision. What happened was that the chairman of a company, a multi-million pound company, who owned 70,000 shares, wanted to retire. And because he'd been in the business many years, he decided that $65 per share was a good price for the company to be sold for. He gathered the directors without telling them why they were being gathered. He gave them a 20-minute presentation without producing any financial statistics and talked them into agreeing. And they did agree. Unfortunately, the minority shareholders objected and found that the better offer would have been $70. Because the directors hadn't bothered to take any care when finding out what the price, when deciding on the price, they were subjected to a liability of $40 million because they hadn't bothered to do their job, to obtain the information before making a decision. And it was clear, in fact, that the fact that they were going to make a lot of money from the sale of their shares played a large part in their behavior. Now, this duty of care is very serious. Directors get into real difficulties with the courts and with the shareholders if the company loses money because they've been lazy or failed to take enough steps to get the information in front of them before making a decision. The courts understand you can make a mistake when making a decision. The courts won't really criticize you so much for that because everybody makes mistakes. The courts understand if you're acting in good faith, trying to do your best, then you may make a mistake and you're not going to be blamed or made financially liable. But if you don't bother to take any steps to gain the information before making a decision, that's a totally different matter. Judges will look really not so much at whether the action taken was in the best interest of the company. They'll look at the process of how you gathered the information and whether you went through the right steps to gather the information before making the decision. This is known in the West as the business judgment rule. The judges won't attempt to say they know how to run the business better than the directors. And the duty of loyalty. Well, this is when a director has a conflict of interest. Anytime the directors are in a position to put their own interests ahead of the interests of the corporation, there's a duty of loyalty problem. For example, let's say the corporation enters into a contract with a business which is in fact owned by one of their own directors. Well, this director is immediately in a conflict situation. He's being pulled in 2 directions. He or she is under a duty to maximize the profit for the company where they sit as a director, where also they're under a duty to try and maximize the profit for the company which they own. The business judgment rule never applies in conflict of interest cases. What the courts do here is look much more closely at what was done to test whether or not they were loyal. And so who are these duties owed to? Well, they're owed to the corporation. If the managers or directors breach these duties, the corporation will have a claim against them. If the corporation, the other directors, won't take action against them, then the shareholders can bring what is called a derivative court action against them on behalf of the company. The shareholders can do this from the power that they derive from being the owners of the shares of the company, meaning they're the owners of the company. It is the company that the directors owe the duty to, not the shareholders. Although that's a very arguable point, because who owns the company? Well, the shareholders. And who gets to remove the directors at the annual general meeting? The shareholders. So would you really deliberately annoy the owners? Probably not. But if you were doing something criminal, you'd probably want to keep it secret from them. So there are two types of breaches of duties: non-feasance, and misfeasance. Misfeasance is doing something wrong. No need to give any further explanation. Something criminal, something bad. Non-feasance is failing to do your duty. In Barnes and Andrews, the owner of the company appointed his golfing buddy as a director. When he appointed him, the company had lots of money, but they didn't bother to produce any goods. They just paid salaries for 9 months, and then they went bankrupt. Clearly, the director who was appointed as a golfing friend had failed to ask any questions, although he saw the chairman every week to play golf. However, he wasn't made personally liable because there was no cause, no obvious causation of loss. So let's move on, if I may, to local laws, okay? Let's jump right ahead to Article 162 of the CCL. This is the liability of the board of directors. Article 162 is the most common provision referred to and referenced when mentioning directors' liabilities. It says that the members of the board are liable towards the company, the shareholders and third parties for all acts of fraud, which is criminal deceit, misuse of power, and violations of the CCL itself or the Articles of Association of the company. And under Article 162 of the CCL, all members of the board are guilty if the error arises from a decision passed unanimously by them. Now, this doesn't apply to those directors who objected, but an important point here: to object as a member of the board, it's not enough to say, I object. You must put your objection in writing and submit it as quickly as possible to the chairman of the board immediately or as quickly as possible after the meeting. Okay, well, I think we'll jump ahead, if we may, to the DIFC. Just one slide, and then I think I've said everything I need to do about the general principles. Obviously, in the UAE, a lot of companies are registered at the DIFC. There used to be a law from 2009. It was replaced in 2018 by the DIFC law number 8. And it says that a director has these duties in a company registered with the DIFC: act in accordance with the Articles of Association and the exercise of your powers, promote the success of the company, exercise independent judgment. It's very important that you discuss things before you make a decision. Exercise reasonable care, skill, and diligence, avoid conflicts of interest, don't accept benefits from third parties. Well, that could include a bribe, which of course is a criminal offense as well. And if you have an interest in something you're discussing, you must declare it so that the other members of the board know whether or not to pay a great deal of attention to what you say, or whether there's a risk that you might be biased. So those are the general principles under which directors and officers find themselves, both in the UAE and outside the UAE. You'll find the DIFC rules are very similar to the CCL rules. So I'll leave you with that for now. I'll be happy to take questions later if there's time. Thank you very much for your attention, everyone. Thank you, Suraya.
Thank you, Richard. So Richard just covered very briefly the principles under the company's law, both in UAE and the DIFC jurisdiction. We will move on to Ayesha to hear and learn more about the considerations, board considerations during these times of uncertainty. So we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Ayesha.
Thank you, Suraya. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. So the background to this presentation really is me wanting to share some of the 8 years of experience that I have with regard to boards, and some of the considerations that board members really should look at during uncertain times. I wanted to start off really by saying, first of all, that COVID-19, the pandemic that we're actually currently going through, is primarily a major health crisis. And it's unprecedented. It's also unprecedented and unique because absolutely everybody in the world is going through this situation. Just a point on the economic impact. To date, we don't know what the economic impact is of COVID-19, but just as an example, McKinsey recently did a study whereby they talked about how they're currently seeing 40 to 50% drop in discretionary spending alone today, which they're translating to around a 10% reduction in GDP before any other impacts are put into that, which is actually unprecedented in modern history. So we know that the impact of this is going to be major economically. Whilst most organizations will have had some contingency plans in place, it is also likely that nobody saw COVID-19 coming. It was not on any risk list. And perhaps some health organizations may have had it on their risk list, but it would have been at very, very minimal risk. So in these uncertain times, what boards need to do, I can go back. What boards need to do is they need to ensure that the organization that they're running is as agile and adaptive as it can be, because what is happening at this stage is the resilience of the organization is being tested. And the role of the board really at this point in time is much more critical, because their interaction with management becomes much more frequent as they try and guide and support management by finding a balance during this crisis to continue to promote the success of the organization. So therefore, what are some of the considerations that boards need to look at during a time of uncertainty? And I've categorized them into 6 main focus areas, but really what we're looking at is what is happening at this time is the resilience of the organization is being tested. So the first and most important one is the operational resilience. So we need to answer the question as board members, can this company continue to do the business it's doing? Can it continue to provide its services? The second area I focused on is the strategic resilience. So is the organization in this crisis actually relevant to its customers today? What about tomorrow? And what about the longer term? The personal resilience. So does the management team, does the board have the leadership skills to be able to guide the management through the challenge that they're currently facing? And then I've lumped together other factors that we consider important and focus areas in what I call overall resilience. And these are things like, do we understand the new risks? Are they being mitigated? Has the organization communicated with its stakeholders? Because obviously they're going to be very nervous in this situation. What about the culture of the organization? How's that being impacted? And are we embracing new aspects such as technologies? So I'm going to just walk through the 6 different focus areas, if I may. Sorry, next slide. So the first focus area is regular reviews of strategy, contingency, and crisis response plans. And this impacts the operational and strategic resilience. Now, ordinarily, as part of the board's agenda items should be regular reviews and constructively challenging the strategy and the business continuity plans in a normal, everyday occurrence. During a crisis, what's actually being tested are these crises plans and also the resilient systematic review process that you've already set up. And so, as I mentioned, suggestions for boards is that they need to ensure that they have these crisis management business continuity plans, that, you know, what's being tested is how robust these crisis response plans are and the capability that's already been built up in the organization, because this is what's going to impact whether the organization is able to survive a crisis. And the importance of having these plans regularly tested, because they form part of the operational resilience frameworks. Now, I mentioned earlier on that COVID-19 is primarily a health crisis. So of immediate importance for board members is to ensure that the health and safety of employees is being managed. And for that, continuous communication with management, supporting them to make sure the well-being of the organization stakeholder is paramount. The business continuity plans need to exist for each of the critical services. So boards need to ensure that each of the services that are critical are identified, plans exist, they're being monitored, and that they're being monitored to show that they're effective and appropriate for the crisis. Obviously, cash flow and liquidity will probably be the major stress area for most boards during a time of crisis, and they need to be urgently and regularly reviewed. And really, the board's key role here is to support the management to match the variability that they're going to find between the revenue and the costs, and try to ensure that adequate levels of cash flow exist for that business to be able to continue to operate. It is actually suggested during a crisis time to have a multifunctional crisis committee that meet much more frequently and report back to the board on updates and recommendations. And at minimum, we would see a team comprising of expertise in communication, legal and operations, because again, these are the major areas that will need to be communicating and interacting, let me say, with stakeholders. This second slide, please. Scenario planning is a very useful approach during a time of uncertainty. And it's useful because what it does is it bounds manageable and it bounds uncertainty into manageable and measurable boxes. And so therefore it tries to reduce confusion and actually sort out what really matters and what is unknown. And actually what we find is that boards tend to spend most of their time in scenario planning during a crisis situation. So what are scenarios? Scenarios really are pictures of the future, and generally they are created over different time horizons. So depending on the organization, depending on how important the operations are, they can be 1 day, a week, a month, different time periods to understand the impact of the crisis on the operations. And contingency plans are then built up, which include the cost benefit analysis for those different scenarios should certain triggers be pushed. Now, what's important to note is that scenarios don't necessarily have to cover all possibilities, but what is important in scenario planning is actually the iterative thinking through of the contingencies and the financial implications and the resource allocations that the organization may have to have in place to ensure that it's resilient should a crisis happen. And so boards and the teams tend to create and come up with trends and uncertainties. They identify them, they look at them at different extremities, and that actually creates the scenarios. And then you look at indicators and forward-looking intelligence to be monitored on a regular basis to try and understand which of the scenarios are coming to fruition. So for example, if we look at the current trends from the pandemic, what we find is deglobalization is one of them, which means that the global supply chains are being impacted. And so it is likely that we're going to see more local purchasing and less reliance on single-sourced global products as a result of the current pandemic. We've also seen a lot more technology come into life, and that's, for example, this webinar is one example, and we're seeing, workplace culture shift, and we're seeing increasing flexibility from organizations. And we're also seeing, and I think this will happen more and more, is going to be a consolidation of economic power into the hands of giant corporations. So those who have cash are going to be able to pick up assets much cheaper. And we're seeing that already with, say, for example, the Saudi and the Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth funds who have been, looking for cheaper assets and able to buy assets at a better price. Now, McKinsey's talk about having a separate, what they call plan ahead team to actually work on scenarios. And the team works very closely with the finance team. Generally, they're separate from the crisis team because they focus on different aspects. And the most important thing about the plan ahead team is that they need to have a bias towards speed over perfection. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to create plans. It doesn't necessarily mean that the plans have to be perfect, but what you're trying to do is have a roadmap to have some direction, and as you keep monitoring, that roadmap changes. The final point just on scenario planning is that scenarios also support organizations to find that balance between being lean and being resilient. And so what we find is that scenario planning help organizations understand why they may need to build in some redundancy into their operations to be able to survive. So for their strategic resilience, that is also an important point. The second focus area for boards is succession planning, people and culture, and that impacts really the personal resilience of an organization. I don't think I need to tell people about the importance of having the right culture and the right people in the organization to live the values and have, you know, a successful organization. But during a time of crisis, these matters become even more crucial because you're relying on your employees especially to help the organization to succeed. So some of the suggestions are to ensure that we have emergency succession plans, so ensuring that all the key leaders have alternates being identified. Obviously, review of policies. So, you know, reviewing, monitoring, understanding how the crisis is impacting different policies. Today, we see, you know, the travel and flexible working policies, minimum staffing policies needing to be changed. We're seeing remote technology being implemented more into businesses. And we've seen what Emirates, say, for example, and EMAR have done with compensation plans. So we're seeing live examples today of how policies are being reviewed and having to adapt to because of the current crisis. In some organizations, developing an emergent structure is important for rapid initial responses. And what that means is actually pushing and empowering some of the more junior staff to take on and make decisions because they're closer to the front line. In certain organizations, this is how they help employees feel more ownership of the organization and empower them to own those decisions. And also, it's really important to make sure that during a crisis, we don't forget the culture. You know, it is one of the main roles of the boards to help management build the right culture, have the right teams, build up the right talent pipeline. And, you know, good people want to work for good organizations, and they're not only looking at financial performance. And so the response of organizations during a crisis is very important because this is what is being monitored by not only the top talent, you know, but most of the stakeholders. And also, you know, we need to understand just the impact on culture of changing aspects like technology, say, for example, you know, whether we need to reskill and redeploy some of our people. So we've seen the example of the Majid al-Fatayim group, which, you know, they had a peak in their Carrefour sales, and so they have reskilled and redeployed some of the staff that were in other operations that had a fall in demand into Carrefour to be able to support in that effort. The third focus area then is risk oversight, and you know, Richard mentioned the importance of risk. You know, I think the point I just want to stress here is that the board must have oversight of the key risks, and scenario planning again is a great tool to help in supporting developing scenarios and contingencies for those risks. For the COVID-19 pandemic, the key risks really that organizations are finding today is that they don't know the magnitude of it and they don't know the duration. And those really are the ones that they have to really carefully monitor and see how the organization is going to be able to survive that. So for boards, it's suggested to look at new risks. So what are the new risks that have come out of the crisis? You know, other new mitigation plans that have to be put into place. So for example, you know, new travel restrictions, remote working, disruptions to supply chains, obviously global macroeconomic conditions changing due to the current crisis. And I think we will unfortunately see more credit and liquidity risk issues coming up as time ticks on with this crisis. Risk awareness and compliance. In general, the board need to ensure that management is educating their employees about their own personal responsibilities with regard to risk. And compliance functions also need to ensure that enough coverage exists within the organization for their risks. And again, that's just enhanced in a crisis situation with new risks coming in. So the importance of making sure that that coverage is being put into place. And finally on risk, I just wanted to mention a point about delegation, because what we find in many boards, the risk responsibility is delegated to the audit committee. Some in other organizations, it can actually be separated, where you have the compliance part of the risk compliance part delegated to the audit committee, and the investment part of risk actually delegated to an investment committee, say, for example. But again, I just want to stress on the point that it's actually the full board that has to take ownership for the oversight of these risks and to ensure that contingencies are in place to mitigate them. So there's no way apart from the board being responsible for having the oversight there. The fourth focus area then is on stakeholder engagement communications. And most boards and successful companies have good and regular and strong communication with their stakeholders through multiple channels. And again, during a crisis, all that's happening here is that's being ramped up, and stakeholders want to hear more because they're nervous. So suggestions are for boards to consider having, a lot more regular communications to increase the confidence. And it's not only about just having that regular communication. It's why we actually say that the board should oversee the communication that is sent out to the stakeholders, because it needs to set the right tone. It needs to ensure that it's eliminating panic, and it's providing that transparent communications, because you're trying to reinforce confidence. And we find that the role of the investor relations team is also quite critical during a time like this, because they're trying to proactively reassure shareholders of what's happening within the organization and the steps being taken to manage a crisis. The transparency and the empathy of the communications is also very important. And, not only do they have to be regular, but they really have to identify the severity of the event, the steps that the organization is actually going to take, and they have to be empathetic. Because everybody, and as I said, COVID-19 is quite unprecedented, because everybody is being impacted in some way, shape, or form from this crisis. And what that does as well is that it helps combat rumors and to rebuild again the confidence in the organization. Some organizations, multi-channel communications through a communication campaign is necessary with stakeholders, whereby they're in different languages and in different modes of communications. But I think what we're seeing again is that communications will have to be across multi-channels, and we're seeing technology come into the fray much more now, where even on boards we have more telephonic, electronic participation. This webinar is an example. We're having AGMs now that are being held online, and shareholders participating. The fifth focus area then is with regard to board evaluation. Now, board evaluation, regular board evaluation is important. It happens normally in the annual review of boards to examine, the skill set, the experience, and the performance of the board. We recommend that happens anyway on an annual basis. And again, this is just being heightened in a crisis situation. But what's critical here is that the board need to make sure that they have the right skill set, because leadership is crucial in being able to survive in a crisis situation. And so where the boards don't have that experience, it is imperative that they act upon it, and that they bring in the necessary third-party experience and guidance quickly, because it's the board that provides the oversight and the guidance to management to help them through the crisis. It's suggested as well to ensure that there are alternates and new committees if needed for boards in a crisis situation. And again, continuous self-evaluation. I think Richard mentioned about the quality of the information. That doesn't stop in a crisis situation where there's a lot more uncertainty. It's really about making sure that the information, the experience, and the where things are unknown, bringing in the people who have that ability to advise both the board and and the management to be able to guide through the crisis. And then finally, when the crisis is over, it is also suggested to have a post-mortem review. And this is important because it helps boards understand what worked and what didn't work, and how the structure can be changed. And again, remember, what I'm trying to say from the beginning is that resilience is the main point that is being tested when we go through a crisis. And so every step we're trying to take as board members is to try and enhance the resilience of the organization. The final area, the sixth area, is really about technology. And I think, digital transformation is here to stay. It's going to impact and change the way business operates. And it's something that management boards and everybody within an organization needs to accept. I think nothing has reinforced this point more than the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been a massive catalyst to push organizations that weren't technology savvy to get online overnight and to automate their services where they possibly could. And so I think it's important for boards to ensure that they understand that technology isn't just about defensive technology. So it's not just about understanding what have we got in place to avoid attacks such as cyber attacks and to prevent applications, but it really is about embracing and developing the right culture and expertise to start integrating technology into the operations, the performance, the strategy, and the risk of the organizations. And again, the emphasis here is that the boards really need to identify and address their knowledge gaps. So they need to ensure that they understand these new technologies. They need to ensure that the purpose is clear, and where they don't, whether new committees need to be created, whether new parties or third parties need to come in to provide up-to-date knowledge on the digital transformation. And really some of the areas that we're really seeing, I think, as I said, automation and providing services online has had a overnight success and from the pandemic, but other areas of technology such as blockchain, virtual reality, 3D printing, we're seeing really come out into the front from this crisis. So just the next slide. What I've hoped to have done during just this presentation is just provide you with some of and share some of my experience through my 8 years of being on a board as to how we try and make organizations more agile and adaptive. And especially during a crisis, what's really being tested is the resilience that we've already put into the organization. And for me, there are really 6 key areas that boards really should consider that impact the different aspects of resilience of an organization. And that's really the strategy reviews, contingency plans, and the crisis response plans. It's the people, the culture, and ensuring that we have succession planning in place for that. It's the risk and the impact of that. It's ensuring that we communicate and we continue to engage with all of our stakeholders so that they know what is happening. It's ensuring that we have the leadership in the boards to make sure that we're able to manage through the crisis. And then it's also about understanding the technology and the impact and not being scared of it, but starting to integrate that into the culture and the organization. Just the last slide. I just wanted to mention that this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, this presentation is built up on an article that I wrote at the beginning of the month called Board Considerations During a Time of Uncertainty. They're all on LinkedIn. I've also yesterday released another one about women leaders and championing them. But if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them, and I can also be contacted by email and on LinkedIn. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ayesha. That was very informative. I think you gave us lots of practical tips there. If you are on a board and having to make some, decisions during these uncertain times, that you gave a lot of practical tips there. Very informative and insightful. I can see some questions coming through. There's not too many, but one says the voice is cutting. I'm not sure if you can hear clearly. I seem to have heard you throughout, so apologies for any technical mishaps. Some people have asked for the presentation, so yes, we will share the presentations. I can see there are 2 questions from the audience, not specifically related to what we were discussing about. 2 questions are a little bit off point, so I'll come back to those. Before we answer those, what I wanted to just go to really quickly is how we can help you during these uncertain times. So if you are a board or you're a director or a manager in the UAE or even abroad, we do have many lawyers who are both qualified and experienced in the UAE and abroad to advise you on those directors' duties and liabilities. And of course, drafting any of the documents to support you in terms of shareholder resolutions, if you are making any changes in organizations, supporting with annual general meetings if there are that, similar to what Ayesha touched on in terms of crisis management plans and support management. This is what we can do during this time. So if you are looking at, say, restructuring within your organization because you've had to look at how you're going to survive these uncertain times, and restructuring is an option for you, we can support you on that. Generally, we can do legal health checks to look at the various decision-making processes and policies and checking that those are in line at the moment with the resolutions that are coming out, for example, in terms of employment, looking at commercial contracts and seeing what your liabilities are just commercially and how to negotiate those, liaising with any government authorities and looking at ways that you might take advantage of the initiatives that many of the governments have implemented, governments and reasons have implemented during these times. So that's a little bit on how we can help. We also have our online support packages, so please go to the Corona Crisis Support Hub if you've got any questions. I know at the moment everybody's budgeting and they're quite, they're quite tight financial times, but we do have some cost-effective packages on there. If you need to contact us, please do. These are all our details. We will send this presentation out to you, so you'll have those available. If I can, yes, I've got lots of people coming through asking us for the presentation. So yes, we will send that through. What I might do though is open the floor to people just to tell us a bit more about their experience during this time and what they're finding the current challenges are. So what I can see is that there's not too many questions, but if you don't have a question, but rather some just a conversation and discussion about what you're finding challenging at the moment and how you'd like to be supported in that regard, or just to even give us an opinion on what you're doing. I can see, let me just have a look quickly at the questions that have come through. One of the questions is whether due to the pandemic, how do we see contractual liabilities will be managed by landlords for their tenants, especially for tenants who have 3 to 5 year contracts? I might take that one because it's not specific or relevant to what Ayesha spoke on. It doesn't really touch on what Richard spoke on in terms of directors' liabilities. Let me tell you, when it comes to contractual and commercial arrangements, such as a tenancy agreement between a landlord and a tenant, at the moment we haven't seen any changes in the real estate laws. We haven't seen anything by the Real Estate Rental Committee or any resolutions that come from the Dubai Land Department on the scenario governing the contracts between landlords and tenants. At the moment, it is a case of looking at your contract, seeing what the penalties are, seeing what the force majeure contract says, and looking and determining whether there is a force majeure situation. Although at the moment in tenancy agreements, there doesn't seem to be. So the contracts that we've looked at so far, I'd say they were more just a commercial arrangement that came down to discussions and negotiation between landlord and tenant. There is nothing at this stage that gives us more insight into what a landlord can do or what they can't do, or whether a tenant can enforce any particular situations or negotiations when they are speaking with a landlord. At this stage is purely commercial. You need to look at the terms, have an open discussion with your landlord, and come to an agreement that is mutual between the parties. So I hope I've answered that for you, Himanshu. We do have another question. Question to Ayesha. Does she see that the boards will look to de-risk their own membership?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure legally how they can, because, and Richard maybe can speak about this in more detail legally, but one of the duties of the boards is to have the oversight of risk. So the way they can the way they can help themselves is by bringing in more expertise, by bringing in the knowledge that they have, a gap in, by ensuring that contingency plans, because I'm sure, again, as Richard had mentioned earlier, what the law is trying to look for is that the boards have done everything that they possibly can to address a risk or an issue. So they're looking to see willingness, they're looking to see the actions of bringing in somebody who has the information, they're looking to see the contingency plans that are in place. De-risking it, I mean, ultimately the boards are being given that responsibility by the shareholders to guide and have the oversight of the management. So it is their responsibility to have that oversight. But as long as they've put in enough processes, procedures, frameworks, policies, that is what the law, I believe, is looking for, to ensure that they have done their duty. So they've taken the care to be able to ensure that they've put those acts in place. Richard, I don't know if you want to comment on that from a legal perspective.
No, only, let me just, yes, only really to echo what you've said. The directors will be required possibly to show that they took every step they could to obtain the necessary information before making a decision. You can, as you say, subcontract out, if you like, to a risk committee, but they're going to report back to the directors, and then the directors are going to have to show that they took all the steps they could to get the right information before making a decision. If you've got good members of the risk committee, then you've probably gone a long way towards doing that. There is something else, I just want to mention this in relation to risk. I'm assuming the questioner didn't mean directors' risk insurance, which is where companies can insure directors against making bad decisions. I'm assuming the questioner was asking about how can directors show they covered the risk rather than the insurance that's available in the West. Okay, so nothing else really than that.
There wasn't much expanded on that, but I believe so, Richard. So another question for Ayesha is, what in your opinion are the skill sets required to qualify to be on a board?
That's an interesting one, and there are many initiatives actually to try and increase women participation on boards, which is primarily what my second article really is about. I'm not necessarily sure that there are specific qualifications to be on the board, other than understanding corporate governance, having a general understanding of a business and how businesses operate. I think what happens when you get onto boards is really that you need to start educating yourself about how boards operate, what good corporate governance is all about, and what are the expertise, because actually a good board functions by having different expertise. So you have somebody that's very good at finance, you have somebody that's very good at strategy, HR, etc. So you actually need all the different types of expertise in that team to be able to make good decisions. But one thing that I've always been taught is that boards work on working together. So there's no point in being on a board that is where people are trying to fight each other or where there's a power play. It's actually better to be on boards where people can constructively work together, find solutions. But I would suggest one of the things I did very early on, I started my first board in 2012, which was in TCOM. And one of the things I did is I went and got myself educated on what good corporate governance was. And I became a chartered director from the Institute of Directors in the UK. And that was about a 3-year timeline to get qualified to be a chartered director. But that was very, very important, because it teaches you what your role is as a board, what your duties are, and what your duties are not. Because, in some boards can be very operational, where the management is trying to get the board to make all the decisions. And that isn't the right way to be. Some boards can be very hands-off, where, the management don't really want the board interfering. So you've got to understand what your duties are as a board member, and also what are not your duties. And then that was, for me, that was massive. So I would say go and get yourself educated on what good corporate governance is. But boards, a team of boards need to have a variety of skill sets.
Thank you, Ayesha. I can see that we have some more questions. but again, they're not specifically related to Richard or Ayesha. So I'll just quickly cover those. One of the panelists asks whether we can help with legal agreements. Yes, we can, definitely. We can look at a variety of agreements, regardless of the industry, and look at those and essentially tell you what your obligations are under those, if that's what you're looking at, or how they might be affected now during the corona period, and give you some advice on that. We can do that. We also have another question related to the labour law amendments regarding termination, and do we follow the same as the old contract? So I won't go into it in too much depth in this particular discussion, because we're not talking about the labour law or the termination provisions under contracts today. But I will say just generally that there was a ministerial resolution in employment law that came out, which specifically looked at what options there were by employers in the current COVID-19 period, and none of those addressed the issue of termination. So currently termination is still as it would have been under the labour laws, the existing labour laws. So nothing has changed there. If you're going to be terminating, you need to take the same procedures. And if you do terminate for a reason which is not a valid or work-related reason, then you may still be liable for dismissing somebody without a good enough reason, and therefore compensation. Although we are untested times, so I don't like to tell anybody very confidently that they're liable for something which they may not be. We are in unprecedented times, and ultimately will be a court decision to make about the termination of whether that was done lawfully or not. But please do tread with caution and make sure that you have gone through all of the options that are available to you as an employer under the ministerial resolution before you have gone down the path of termination. So I'll just say that on this topic. Let me take the other two questions that have just come through that relate to board positions. Ayesha, during this period, how many of your boards were run using Zoom or similar versus sitting face-to-face, and do you see that becoming the normal?
All my boards right now are being either on Zoom or webinars. Do I see it becoming the normal? I think it may start coming in, but I think once the crisis is over, people are actually going to want to sit together once everything is, they feel safe enough. They are still going to want to have that interaction. So I think it's going to come into play. I think Charles is the person I just saw asking that question. I mean, we'll see that we have the DP World AGM happening on Thursday, I believe, this week. That is again online. So we're seeing it more and more, and I think it's going to be there as an option. But I think people will want to interact with people where they can. So for boards perhaps that are around the world, we might see less flying in and flying out. But I think if they're in country, people may still want to actually have that interaction, that human interaction.
Great, thank you. I believe that's all the questions we have at the moment. I can see another one from Charles where he says, spread boards across the world and in safer locations or across a more diverse age and gender group. So I think perhaps he was seeking what your opinion is on that. So having boards that are across the world, not necessarily in the one location, and having them from a diverse age and gender group, just to give the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think, when we talk about boards, it's about diversity, both gender, qualifications, nationality. We're talking about all different aspects, because you've got to remember the board is trying to reflect and make decisions about products that they're selling to their stakeholders. So if your customers are buying and they're from all different types of, diversity, you want to ensure that you're able to make better decisions by having that diversity on the board. As I said, experience, qualifications, gender, nationality, ethnicity, etc. I think the only other point I did see in the questions was about the different types of corporate governance. So as I mentioned earlier that I'd gone to the UK to do my corporate governance training. We've obviously got Haukama in Dubai that do that as well. You've got the GCC Board of Directors that do that here. So there are lots of different institutes locally and internationally that can help in supporting people learn more about corporate governance.
Great. So we've just had another question come through which asks, when companies are going through a crisis, what would be the fate of CSR, which I'm assuming is corporate social responsibilities, role of the company, if any?
I mean, maybe just to comment on that, I think what we're seeing is where companies can, they're actually increasing their CSR initiatives. I mentioned in my presentation that, you know, good people want to work for a company, a good company. And when I mean by a good company, it's not just the financial performance, it's a company that actually does good, gives back to society, you know, helps during a time of crisis. They feel that, you know, by working for these organizations, the loyalty that they give into these organizations will be given back in a time of need. So I think where organizations can, they will try to do more on the CSR. Obviously, you know, the immediate tasks are to manage the operations, to ensure that the company can continue to operate, you know, the cash flow. Those are the immediate concerns. But where they can, I think CSR becomes important, and we're seeing organizations do that, you know, focusing on their employees, making sure that they're okay. I think that continues as long as an organization can do that.
Thank you. I can see that there's no further questions, but what I might do is just pose a question to the audience and they can write into the webinar chat. But how many of you that are currently either sitting on a board or in managerial positions are looking at corporate restructuring, or looking at how to not de-risk, but, you know, if they are in current difficulty, how they're going to, or how they envision they're going to weather the storm of the COVID-19. Is there anything that they, or any considerations that they're making that we've not touched upon during this that they'd like to hear more about? Or even if they can just share their experience and what considerations they've made during these times. Is there anybody going through this at the moment in their organizations, whether they're on a board or in a management position? Perhaps they can share with us in the webinar chat. We may make it, I'm not sure we're able to open. No. Okay, if we don't have any further questions, or we don't have anybody who, so Charles says, crisis rule number 1, don't panic. That's very true too. Don't panic, but it's also best to plan. So I think it's, you know, it's hoping for the best, but planning for the worst in these times, isn't it, Ayesha?
Absolutely. Again, scenario planning is something that we've done. I've done a lot of work with. A lot of what I created in terms of scenario plans in 2015 are actually coming out today. So it's quite interesting to see how all that planning and thinking through. And it really is about using scenarios to think through different options. That's really where the gift of scenario planning as approach comes. It's not necessarily the outcome, it's the thinking through that is the most important part of it.
Definitely, I have to agree with you. And I think also the point that you made about having a multifunctional committee where you're looking at operationally and then legally and then technically all the different elements that come together to really help you to plan that scenario and you know, put yourself in the situation and say, right, through this scenario, this is the steps that we're going to take that will get us out, hopefully, to weather this COVID-19. But as you said, it's really a case of getting on board the people who have that expertise to help you make the right decision during these times. So thank you so much for that presentation. I hope you found it all very insightful. Richard, thank you. I know you touched very briefly as well on the director's liabilities, but if there's anything more that you'd like to know about that, please reach out to us. All our details are here. I can see one question has come through, and that's from Treno about how important is communication at this time, particularly communication from leaders. I'm putting a video out tomorrow on LinkedIn suggesting leaders and CEOs begin a conversation with staff. Do you think that now is the time for more empathy rather than formality? So I think, Ayesha, this is probably more addressed to you as well. What's your opinion on empathy versus formality during these times?
Well, I mean, I think communication is crucial. You know, this is the time stakeholders want to hear from organizations, but this is the time where they want to hear from them a lot more because they want to know what's going on, and they're panicking. And it's not, as I said, stakeholders not only, you know, your customers and your shareholders, your employees as well. And empathy is absolutely crucial. As I said, COVID-19 is specific in that it's, first of all, a health crisis, so it's about the well-being of your stakeholders, and secondly, it's a pandemic and a crisis that's impacting everybody. So there is nobody in the world that hasn't been impacted, and so empathy goes a long way in building confidence and trust in the management and the board, and in people supporting the organization. So I think that's a fantastic you know, initiative that Ethno is doing.
Thank you, Ayesha. I couldn't agree anymore. More. So thank you all for joining us. It seems like we don't have any further questions, but if any questions do come to mind post this session, please do reach out and email us. We do have lots of upcoming webinars in the next weeks. We hope to do as we've done now, where we will speak about a legal topic, but bring somebody then who's also an expert in the industries, just to give you more diversity and a more rich content to hopefully help you in making decisions during these tough times. So without further ado, I just wanted to thank again Ayesha and Richard. I think we'll close the session for today. We will definitely send to all the presentation slides, and we look forward to joining you at our upcoming and next seminars. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.